Gracious God, may only your word be spoken and your word be heard. Amen. Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the things that I am most grateful for in my life is that my husband does most of the cooking. He is much better at it than I am. He's more creative with ingredients, able to whip something up from the remnants in the fridge when I would have looked and said, ugh, there's nothing to eat. But one place we frequently disagree is how much salt is needed. I tend to like things pretty salty. He does not. We're at the point where he'll just hand me a plate of food and say, you're going to want to put salt on that. You see, the thing about salt is that if you put in too little, then the salt won't do its job. And if you put in too much, then the salt is not doing its job either. Because salt's job is to draw out the goodness in the things around it, to highlight and emphasize the innate flavors in everything else in the dish. Too little salt, and that goodness in others doesn't get highlighted. Too much salt, and it overwhelms everything, smothering the opportunity for the other ingredients to shine. And the same problem exists when you think about light. If there's too little light, then you can't actually see what the light is supposed to show you. If there's too little light, then plants and crops that need the light are not able to grow. But if there's too much light, well, too much light can blind you, and you still can't see what it is that the light is supposed to show you. With too much light, the plants and the crops in the field will be scorched. What we really need is just the right amount of light. The right amount of light to illuminate what it is that we need to see. The right amount to show us the truth of what is around us. The right amount of light to help us grow. But how is it that we are supposed to discern the right amount of these things? How are we supposed to know what makes for too little or for too much? For me this week, these were the questions that were rattling around my head as I continued to think about the death of Tyre Nichols. As I watched the news and read the articles and watched a portion of the video footage of his murder. I confess, I only got about halfway through that video before I turned it off. And I understand that I have the immense privilege of being able to turn it off. And there were two specific things that I could not stop thinking about from that video. I kept thinking about when I was a kid and I got a concussion. And in the aftermath of that concussion, I remember being so confused that I did not recognize my big sister when she came to help. That I couldn't understand what was happening when my mom showed up. When Tyre Nichols was pulled from his car and slammed on the ground, what if he hit his head? What if he got a concussion? And there are police officers screaming at him contradictory instructions, Stay on the ground, raise your hand, get on your stomach, do not move. It would have been confusing and terrifying for someone who was uninjured, let alone for someone who had just hit their head. The other thing I noticed when I was watching the video is that my dog started freaking out. She had been laying on the floor, dozing, but the sound of the shouting on the video startled her awake. And then she began pacing. And then she started anxiously panting. And finally, a little whimper or two as she nuzzled at me. She was actually part of the reason I turned it off. And after I did, she settled down again. What happened to Tyree Nichols in Memphis was so bad, even my dog knew that it was wrong. And as I read and observed the discourse over the last few weeks, questions about policing and the commentary on the police officer's race and what that said about the depth of disease in our system and the history of violence at traffic stops and the critiques of our modern policing system and that it is unsalvageable from its racist origins and how all of that intersects with calls to defund or even abolish the police. As I read and heard all of that, I kept asking myself, what is too little and what is too much? It is clear that we need significant policing reform in our country. Should we truly scrap the whole system and start all over again? What is too little? And what is too much? And how are we supposed to discern the right amount? Jesus follows up his teachings on salt and light by declaring that he has come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Jesus didn't come and throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the teachings of Moses and Elijah and Micah and Amos. He did not come to reject those things. Rather, he came so that the ideals behind those laws and those prophets, the ideals that had never been truly lived up to, that those ideals might finally be fulfilled. And so I think when it comes to questions of justice, questions of ethics, questions of deep societal concern, where we are trying to discern how much is enough in our attempts at reform, I think we would be well served to look where Jesus looked, to the law and the prophets that he came not to abolish, but to fulfill. We can look to readings like the one from Isaiah this morning. In it, the prophet is speaking on behalf of God, critiquing religious observances that are unmoored from the ethical imperatives in which they were originally rooted. God rejects the people's self-serving religious fasts and instead chooses a different kind of fasting. One that loosens the bonds of injustice and undoes the thong of the yoke. A fast that allows the oppressed to go free and then breaks every yoke so that it cannot be used again. When we're looking at complex ethical and moral issues like the question of policing in America today, I think one way to discern what is too much and what is too little might be to ask those questions through the lens of the prophets. What reforms would loose the bonds of injustice? What reforms would allow freedom to those who have been oppressed? What reforms would not only remove the yoke, but would break every yoke so that it can no longer be placed on the shoulders of future generations? If we're trying to navigate our way forward, we can look where Jesus looked, to the law and to the prophets, that he came not to abolish, but to fulfill. And when it all seems like it is just too big to tackle, that the systems of injustice are too large and they are too complex to untangle, we can also remember that Jesus said to his disciples, "You are salt and you are light." The you in those statements is in the second person plural of the Greek. It might be better translated as y'all are salt, y'all are light. In other words, Jesus never asked us to do it alone. We are called to draw out the goodness in others. We are called to illuminate our world, but we are called to do it together. The other thing to note about those two statements is the verb tense. Jesus doesn't say, "You will be salt, you will be light." He says, "You are." We are that salt now. We are that light already. And in the face of large, complex, systemic problems, we can remember that it doesn't take a lot of salt to season a dish. It doesn't take a lot of salt to draw out the goodness of the other ingredients. The goodness is already there. Like God said at the beginning of creation, when God declared all things good. The goodness is there, but sometimes it just takes a little salty invitation for the fullness of that goodness to come out. And it doesn't always take a lot of light. We just need enough to help us see the next right step on the journey. It doesn't always take a lot of light for a plant to start changing. It needs just enough to coax the growth along. And in that, I find comfort and hope that change is possible. That a little bit of work and faithfulness from the disciples of Jesus can go a long way toward building a more just world. Not too much from those disciples of Jesus. Otherwise, we go tromping all over other people's flavors. We shine so bright that we blind everyone and prevent progress. But rather, just enough to spice up and then to brighten up God's world. Amen.